blip on the Yiddish was a short blip on the Yiddish newspaper readers' attention span, tucked away between news and advertisement. Satire, drama, sex, and death were necessary components for a young Yiddish writer who catered to an broad audience and remained highly ambivalent about secular literature. Bashevis first studied to become a rabbi like his father and maternal grandfather, and when that failed, he followed his older brother, the novelist Yitskhok, into the world of Yiddish letters. In the early 1920s, he started to write in Hebrew, but quickly switched to Yiddish. Prior to the rise of modern Yiddish literature in the 19th century, Yiddish literature addressed to quote-unquote women and unlearned men, meaning men who were not able to read Loshin Kodesh, Hebrew, consisted of morality tales, Bible translations, and entertainment. Singer reinvented this traditional framework for modern readership. His talent for suspenseful storytelling, situated in a pre-modern setting, was masterfully displayed in his first novel, Satan in Gurai, which was serialized in 1933 in a journal called Globus. Globus was a journal that Bashevis edited with his good friend, the Yiddish poet Aaron Zeitlin. And it was very ambitious. You know, you call a little Yiddish journal in Warsaw with maybe less than 100 subscribers for the Globus, the world, the planet. and they were at the center of Yiddish world literature at this time. So the novel setting is circumscribed to the shtetl of Gurai, which is located in the Lublin region. And that region would become the primary imaginary map of Singer's work. The shtetl narrative was already established as a main genre by two generations of Yiddish writers that used the Jewish small town in Central and Eastern Europe as a microcosm for their artistic aspirations. At the turn of the 20th century, Yud Lamed Peretz created a corpus of stories in the Hasidic vein, Hasidish, or another series of stories in the folk manner, Volksstimmliche Geschichte, that use shtetl folklore in symbolic and neo-romantic storytelling. Shmuel Niker, the leading Yiddish critic in New York, wrote an enthusiastic review of Satan in Gurai in 1943 that synthesized Singer's radical departure from classical Yiddish fiction. Quote, Peretz introduced a romanticism of holiness and martyrology. Yitskhok Bashevis demonstrated that in desecration and profanity glows an abyss of romanticism as well, unquote. This review spelled out the difference between the romantic ethos of Peretz and Singer's determination to tear down these ideals. In 1943, nobody could have predicted that Singer's nihilism would trump Peretz's humanism in the decades following the Holocaust. From the beginning of his literary career, Singer was fascinated with the interplay of sexual wantonness on innocent, naive characters reared in an ultra-Orthodox environment. He was later accused of desecrating the memory of the Polish Jewish martyrs in the Holocaust. However, as Ruth Weiss, the Yiddish professor, former Yiddish professor at Harvard, points out, quote, as we see from his earliest novel, Bashevis, Singer devised his pornographic vocabulary for evil a decade before the Jews of Europe was destroyed, unquote. The main theme of Satan in Gurai is the battle between sacred and profane. The battleground is the body of a young orphaned woman, Rechele, the only character in the book described from birth to death. Sabbatai Tzvi, who had proclaimed himself the Messiah in 1665, receiving enthusiastic support from the overwhelming majority of Jewish communities in Europe and North Africa until his conversion to Islam in 1666, provided Singer with a historical backdrop for his portrait of how mass psychosis transformed the pious community of Gorai. The punishment of the sinners in the book's final two chapters, framed in the style of an old Yiddish morality book, seems secondary to the narrator's exposition of the sexual impropriety and moral collapse of Gorai. Singer packed the transgressive aesthetics into the neutrality of his narrative voice as exemplified in the mikveh, the ritual bath scene. In Satan Gorai, Singer takes Rechele into the female section of the mikveh, where she customarily is led before her wedding. The scenery is depicted with the disarming simplicity of an old Yiddish storybook. Here excerpted from Jakob Sloan's translation. And we have the quote here. You can follow along in the quote here. I'm going to read it in the translation. Women with shaven heads or badly shorn hair, veteran bathers, sauntered comfortably about, perfectly at home, stark naked, with breasts hanging like lumps of dough, with mighty hips and loose bellies, from continually carrying and giving birth. Waddling about, they familiarly splashed their feet in the puddles of water on the stone floor, and diligently tended to the abased Rechele. They gave her advice on how to arouse her husband's desire and taught her what luck charms to use to conceive male children. The very young women with a small sheep's head played in the bathhouse like silly children, touching Rechele's unshorn hair in amazement, chasing one another about and being generally frivolous. In a corner of the bathhouse, the healer tapped veins, set leeches, and fastened sucking cups. The floor was bloody as a slaughterhouse. An elderly woman spoke grossly to Rechele and confided things to the girl's ears that sent the blood rushing to her head, and she almost sank to the earth with humiliation, unquote. This grotesque subversion of taboos, the mikveh as both slaughterhouse and preparation for procreation sex, enables Singer to contrast Rechele's innocence with his sexual lewdness, violence, and death. Satan in Gorai, subtitle A Story of Bygone Days, imitated the style of old Yiddish storybooks of moral edification. This genre's codified universe of evil and good provides the artistic template through which Singer gives graphic description of antinomian behavior and supernatural realities. The beginning of the novel, almost verbatim model on a 17th century Jewish chronicle related by an omniscient narrator, sets the tone. The distinctly Polish landscape and towns in the Lublin region would remain the geographical map of Singer's storytelling. The narrative begins in the aftermath of Chmelnytsky massacres on the Jews in 1648-49, the worst catastrophe to befall Eastern European Jewry prior to the Holocaust. In the predestined logic of a Greek tragedy, each character must play her and his part in the moral disintegration of Gorai in the aftermath of the catastrophe. The symmetrical structure of the book, 2 parts of 14 chapters each, reflects the ordered universe of Orthodox Judaism from whose perspective the story is narrated. Singer's trademark in Satan and Gorai, as in his short stories, is the conflict between a well-defined universe of good and evil and extreme human passions and beliefs. Contemporary Jewish writer responded to the revolutionary upheaval of World War I in the form of various modernism. Screaming expressionism, Uri Zwie Greenberg, impressionism, David Berkelsen, and introspectivism, Yankev Gladstein. Unlike these modernist trends, Singer turned the tables on modern Yiddish literature by impersonating the collective mentality of the pre-modern Jewish shtetl. This anachronistic approach, removed from the immediate social political realities in the 30s, enables Singer to articulate a broader historical vision. Critics have pointed to the novel's depiction of messianic fervor as a fable about the Jewish messianic beliefs in communism and Zionism. Hitler's rise to power in 1933, the year the novel was first serialized in the Yiddish journal Globus, is obviously another important backdrop. However, Singer is drawing on a broader historical canvas spanning the messianic fervor of Sabbatai Tzvi in the 17th century, the rise of secular Jewish movement in the late 19th century, and the devastation of World War I. Like the German Jewish Kabbalah scholar Gershom Scholem, Singer turned Sabbatai Tzvi into the prototype of his times. Scholem's first published essay about Sabbatai Tzvi, Redemption Through Sin, appeared in 1937. Later in his magistral, his grand study of the false Messiah, Scholem would acknowledge Singer's stories as one of the most vivid expressions of Polish Kabbalism in its, quote, unique fascination with the sphere of evil, unquote. Both Scholem and Singer map the long historical trajectory for Jewish survival and renewal. In Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, Scholem gave a sweeping overview of the breakup of Orthodox Judaism, similar to Singer's novelistic vision in Satan in Gorai. And I quote, Sabbatai Tzvi represents the first serious revolt in Judaism since the Middle Ages. It was the first case of mystical ideas leading directly to the disintegration of the Orthodox Judaism of the believers. Its heretical mysticism produces an outburst of more or less veiled nihilistic tendencies among some of its followers. Finally, it encouraged a mood of religious anarchism on a mystical basis, where it coincided with favorable external circumstances, played a highly important part in creating a moral and intellectual atmosphere favorable to the reform movement of the 19th century. In 1935, Singer followed his older brother, Yudhjah Singer. We have a photograph of the two brothers here from Vorwärts, right after Yitskhok Bashevis arrived in New York on a tourist visa in May 1st, 1935. It is Yudhjah Singer on the left. He, thanks to Yudhjah Singer's reputation, the mostly unknown Yitskhok Bashevis landed a contract with the major Yiddish daily Vorwärts a few months after he arrived in New York. Abraham Kahan, the legendary editor of the Vorwärts, gave Singer permission to serialize his new novel in the newspaper. It began bi-weekly publication on October 5th, 1935, entitled Der Sündige Mashiach, a historischer Roman, The Sinful Messiah, a historical novel. This time, Singer used another controversial figure from Jewish history, Yankev Frank, who was influenced by Sabbatai Tzvi before he and his followers converted to Catholicism in mid-18th century Poland. The novel, which has never been republished as a book, was considered a big flop by Yitskhok Bashevis himself. The next 7 years, Singer ceased to publish serious fiction, but continued his work as a journalist of popular articles. In the fateful year 1943, Singer returned as a fiction writer with a reprint of the novel Satan in Gorai and 5 new stories. 4 of these stories were narrated by the Yitskhok, the evil inclination, part of a planned series of monologues entitled Das Gedenkbuch von Yitskhok, the diary or the book of remembrance of the evil one. Singer's storytelling talent blossomed in these monologues, pre-modern setting and formulaic battle of good and evil among ordinary shtetl Jews tempted by the evil one to perpetrate the most outrageously transgressive acts. Singer turned the monologue into a sustained narrative unit which subverted the aesthetic and ideological ethos of Yiddish writers Yud Lamed Peretz and Shin Ansky, the author of the play Der Dibuk. In Peretz's debut work, the epic poem Monish from 1888, similarly narrated by the evil one, the innocent young Talmud scholar is tempted to perpetrate the ultimate act of heresy. He swears on the Torah that the universe is without a God. In Monish, the temptation is embodied in the beautiful voice of Maria, the Gentile daughter of a German businessman, representing the allure of German Kultur to Monish, the young Talmud scholar. In Singer's monologue, the Sabbatai Tzvi creed of sexual promiscuity as redemption through sin leads the main characters to utter desperation and even suicide. While Monish is punished by having his earlobe nailed to a doorpost in the netherworld, a Jewish purgatory, Singer graphically outlines the collective punishment of the sinners in the story, Der Churben von Cheshev, the destruction of Cheshev, which is one of the monologues in the 43 volume. Encouraged by her husband to commit adultery with a servant named Leibel Schmeiser, the whip, her husband eventually confesses everything to the rabbi of the town. The punishment is swiftly carried out with a vengeance. Lise, carted through the town, becomes the target of verbal and physical abuse from the shtetl's Jews. Again, Singer shticked to the father of Yiddish literature, Yud Lamed Peretz, who in the story Drei Matones, 3 gifts, portrayed a martyred woman's heroism. The woman nailed her clothes to her body with pins, thus maintaining her chastity during a similar act of public humiliation. The main difference, though, is that in Peretz's story, the abusers are anti-Semites, cheered on by priests and the mayor of the town, while in Singer's, the drama is played out entirely among Jews with almost no reference to the Gentile world. Again, Peretz's martyrological universe, the quintessential holy place of Yiddish literature, has been violently imploded by Singer's chillingly detached depiction of the collective orgy of revenge that descends on the poor sinner Lise, who later commits suicide. Singer closes one of his darkest stories with the complete destruction of Cheshev in the Lublin region in a conflagration perpetrated by Leibel Schmeiser. The only character to escape the Yetzer Hora's evil net is Gimbal, Lise's father. This namesake of the righteous Gimbal the Fool, Gimbal Tam, the title of a famous, his most famous story, would reappear under different guises in Singer's stories after the Holocaust. Singer's maturation and popularity as writer was made possible by the ascendance of New York as a major Jewish literary center after the Holocaust. Moreover, Yud Singer suddenly dropped dead of a heart attack in 1944, which literally took the sting out of the Oedipal shadow of his older brother. Bashevis, the obscure fabulist of dark tales from the forgotten past of Polish Jewry, would likely have remained a very original writer in the annals of Polish Yiddish literature. Instead, Singer appeared as an American Jewish writer in the novel The Family Muscat, which was modeled on his brother's realist novels. Then Saul Bellow, who worked on The Adventures of Augie Marsh, one of his breakthrough novel from 1953, translated in one sitting Gimbal the Fool in 1943 into English, 8 years after the story's publication in Yiddish. It was Gimbal the Fool that catapulted Singer into the cutting edge of American letters at an auspicious time for Jewish literature. The post-war period saw the emergence of African-American, Jewish, and other minority writers that departed from the social realism of the 30s, like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, Saul Bellow's The Adventures of Augie Marsh, Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Gimbal the Fool was a schlemiel and Luftmensch on the margin of society. Like these writers, Singer reported from a hitherto unknown world in a colorful, colloquial language that touched a core among a broad readership. In his stories after the Holocaust, the nihilistic vision of mass psychosis and the triumph of evil were balanced by humor, compassion, and even in some cases, even a little hope. Gimbal leaves behind his life as baker and head of a household and becomes a traveling storyteller, abandoning his family's static world for mobility and self-discovery. Like Bellow's Augie Marsh and Kerouac's Soul Paradise On the Road, self-creation in monologue form took precedence over social realism. While joining forces with the American literary writers of the 1940s and early 50s, Singer also tapped the humorous potential of Yiddish literature, represented by Sholem Aleichem. By lifting his stories out of the gloomy state of shtetl dwellers fighting their collective demons, he suffused them with a postmodern, skeptical sensibility removed from the character's social historical conditioning. Gimbal the Fool, the Little Shoemakers, Chacon in the short story A Friend of Kafka, and the semi-autobiographical characters were direct descendants of the shtetl people that Sholem Aleichem had depicted a generation earlier. While most Yiddish writers collectively lamented and sought to keep the memory alive of the murdered European Jews in replicas of a world that is no more, Singer deepened and refined his imaginary vision. As a storyteller and novelist, his work was eminently translatable. Great Yiddish poets Yankov Gladstein, Avram Sutzkever, and Chaim Grade contributed dirges, keenness to the still mostly unknown Book of Lamentation 2 in Yiddish, deemed by irreversible historical and demographic factors to isolation in the world of Yiddish letters. Chaim Grade's story is a novel situated in Vilna, Jerusalem of Lithuania, were destined to become classical chronicles of the Litvak world, internally split between secular and religious movement. A much broader readership preferred singers, postmodern shtetl rabbis, and New World survivors whose turbulent lives teemed with the action of post-war America in the grips of radical transformation of social and moral mores. In a period when Yiddish writers would claim literature as a means to extra literary ends, lamenting and commemorating what had been lost, Singer maintained his artistic independence as storyteller. Even in the novel Enemies, a Love Story, and the short story Cafeteria, the Holocaust served only as backdrop for his grand comedy of human passions and beliefs. Singer clung to the independence of literature of any political, social, and cultural ideologies. Singer's work is intrinsically woven into the web of Yiddish cultural politics, personal relationships, and various newspapers and journals, from Rechte to Linke, in which the shrinking group of New York Yiddish writers and Kulturtours, cultural activists, fought each other and the uphill battle against assimilation and oblivion. Moreover, American letters in the post-war period that provided an ideal breeding ground for young Jewish writer enabled Singer to break out of the increasingly ghetto-like character of Yiddish in New York to become a major player on the American literary scene. Like throngs of Jewish Schneevegelach, snowbirds, Singer moved from New York to Miami part of the year to seek refuge in the warm weather and Jewish delicatessen. The post-9/11 era has even further actualized aspects of Singer's work that highlight moral issues of good and evil, nihilism, and the danger of religious and political fundamentalism. He will remain the most famous and most read Yiddish writer because of his unique vision and literary style. His narrative drive and prolific output, combining American optimism with old world wisdom, remain deeply rooted in Jewish tradition and folklore. The celebration of his centennial in 2004, which should actually have been in 2003, because it turns out he was actually born in 1903, including the Jubilee edition of his short stories in 3 volumes, published by the Library of America, indicate that his literary star is unlikely to dim anytime soon. The story, My Adventures as an Idealist, included in the 3rd volume, is vintage Singer in its bittersweet self-portrait of the artist as young and middle-aged man. The mysterious Sigmund Seltzer, which is a sparkling Freudian alter ego, has commissioned the narrator to write his autobiography. Seltzer wants the narrator to provide a Yiddish translation of a German version ghostwritten by somebody else. The narrator continues to expand the work into a fictitious autobiography that he is unable to complete. The meaning of Seltzer's life becomes tied to his quest to get his ghostwritten autobiography published. Visiting the dying Seltzer in the hospital, the narrator closes the story with this apt observation of literary posterity. Quote, "Our eyes met in silence. His hair had become white and sparse, his forehead higher. An expression of gentleness and wisdom I had never seen before shone in his eyes. He half winked, half smiled, as if to say, 'I know everything that you know and a little more in addition.' He was no longer the Sigmund Seltzer I had known all those years, but a sage purified by suffering. He stared at me with a look of fatherly affection and murmured, 'In the end, what remains after us writers? Nothing but a bundle of paper.'" So I want to end the presentation with just a few example of some of the new books about Singer and the Singer family. Because what's so very interesting is that there's an increasing interest in, particular in Yitskhok Bashevis' older sister, Esther Kreitman, who is a very accomplished writer, and of course also his older brother, Yiddish singer. There is a new book coming out, which I'm very much looking forward to. Was a book that was written by her deceased son, Maurice Carr, who was a journalist. It's called The Forgotten Singer, the Exiled. It should be The Exiled Sister of Yud and Isaac Bashevis, singer. And it's a memoir. It's coming out this summer. And just very briefly about Esther Kreitman. She fled to London at the outbreak of World War I with her husband, who she had married in Antwerp, and was at the center of Yiddish literary life in London. And in 1935, she published the first autobiographical depiction of the Singer family, Der Shatin Tanz, the Dance of Demons, which is a very interesting book that I highly recommend. And she had a correspondence with Yitskhok Bashevis in the late 1930s. She was actually encouraging him to come to London, but it didn't work out that way. Maurice Kreitman, the son, was a very remarkable young man who actually compiled an anthology called Jewish Short Stories of Today. And that is the first time the three siblings in the Singer family were placed next to each other. There was an excerpt from Satan and Gorai. There was a story by Kreitman and also a story by Yud Singer. And Maurice Kreitman worked as one of Singer's many translators. And here is the story. This is a new book that was published a year ago by Princeton University Press, Old Truths and New Cliches, edited by this scholar and translator and the writer David Stromberg in Jerusalem. He also edited and translated part of this story, a new version of Gimple the Fool that was just published. Very interesting book with the Yiddish original text, Gimple Tam, and also Saul Bellows' translation, and this new version, which is based on Isaac Bashevis Singer's own translation and David Stromberg's addition to that translation. He had added 40% to the translation. In next year, Yetzer Hashem, God willing, the book that I'm editing, which consists of the early writings of Isaac of Yitskhok Bashevis from his Warsaw period, will be published by Academic Studies Press. And let me just read this summary of the book. It's called In the World of Chaos, Early Writings. And In the World of Chaos is the title of one of the seminal stories in this collection. As a young man in Warsaw, Isaac Bashevis Singer wrote naturalist stories, sketches, and his first memoir, and translated 11 books of contemporary European literature into Yiddish. Published originally in the Yiddish press under the pseudonym Yitskhok Bashevis, the edition introduces the early writings in fluent English translations. They provide a complete picture of Bashevis's artistic achievement during the Warsaw years from 1925 to 1935, culminating with his first novel, Satan in Gorai. Providing a fascinating prism into the origins of Bashevis's storytelling, they reveal a vibrant, death-infused world on the brink of the Holocaust. The early fiction and nonfiction are annotated, richly illustrated, and includes a literary historical introduction. So this book will come out hopefully spring 2024. And this might not be the cover, but this is a suggestion from the publisher for the cover. So I think this is my presentation. I think I've kept the time frame, and I will open it up now for questions.
Hartelijk Dank, Professor Schwarz, voor de tiefe en spannende lecture. We have some questions already asked on chat. The first two are by Benson Schaefer, and I'll take them one at a time. Could you comment on the different paths taken by Kabbalah in Singer and Hasidism?
Well, I mean, that's a very, very big question, and I don't think I will go there in this presentation. The only thing I would say about that is that Singer grew up in a ultra-Orthodox Hasidic family, and was completely fluent in the primary texts of Kabbalah, like the Zohar and other such texts, and also read, of course, about Sabtai Tzvi and Yanke Frank and so on and so forth. But this is a much more specialized area, and I'm not going to address that now, except for saying that Singer was clearly very fluent and very well read in the primary sources that he based his novels on. Yeah.
Okay, the second question also for Mr. Schaefer is, could you comment on the possible relation between Singer and Dostoevsky?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I mean, we know that from Singer's own memoirs that he was fascinated by Dostoevsky's novels that were translated into Yiddish and read them as a young man. And there are clearly connections between Dostoevsky and Singer. And the question is, of course, is Singer our Yiddish Dostoevsky, or is he something else? I would argue that he's not. I mean, he was informed by the great Russian classics like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, but it's a very different universe. It's a deeply Jewish universe, where Dostoevsky is a deeply Russian universe. But the whole battle between good and evil is very much Dostoevsky-like, and there are definite connections there, I would say. Yeah.
We have a raised hand by Yochanan and Shifra Lohan. So if you would ask your question now, please.
You can unmute yourself, Johan.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Thanks. Thanks so much for a beautiful lecture. I would like to ask, you said that Singer, can I ask in Yiddish?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, ich habe verstanden von euch, als Isaac Bashevis Singer hat gewollt werden ein Ruf, und zum Sof ist geworden ein Schreiber. Und das ist für mich sehr interessant. Ich habe gewollt fragen, wie es der Makor von dem ist, weil ich gedenke nicht, dass sagt, als soll. Ich habe gelernt, dass von Yitskhok Bashevis Singer, speziell seine autobiografische Artikel in Bücher. Und ich gedenke nicht, als sagt, als soll werden sein Ruf, von dem habe ich gewollt das wissen. Ich berate Makor von dem.
Yeah. So I think it was.
So Jan.
Oh, okay. So the question is, Yochanan asked about Singer wanted to become a a rabbi, and he went to a rabbinical schools that I mentioned in my presentation, and he wants to know more about that. So I can tell you that he started in a more modern Orthodox rabbinical school in Warsaw in 1923. But my sense is from the sources I've read and the biographies that are available that it was more out of duty and loyalty to his father that he did that. He was not really seriously thinking about becoming a rabbi, but he did stay in that school for, I think, almost a year, and then he dropped out.
Okay, noch eine Sache oder zwei Sachen. Ich habe gesehen auf Internet, habe ich gesehen, als du eine Kassette von Singer, wie redet wegen seiner Tate in seinem Tatens Sfurim Gebirim in Yiddish, aber ich habe nicht gekannt treffen dem Kassett allein auf dem Internet, nur in der Katalog. And I was very much interested to listen to this. Noch eine Sache, was ich habe gewollt.
Lass mir lassen einander reden und wir können zurückkommen nach.
Okay.
One comment by Nathan Scherzer is, would you please put the recommended books in the chat?
Okay.
Now, by Murray Batt, could you comment on the relation of Singer and Aaron Zeitlin as writers, as opposed to as editors of Globus?
Yeah, so Singer in Warsaw, the young Singer, was very much on the periphery. I mean, the Yiddish literary environment in Warsaw at this time was very ideological, particularly very strongly dominated by communist and socialist writers. And Singer stood apart from that. He was kind of like the art writer on the periphery. And that's how he bonded with Aaron Zeitlin, who also had that same kind of background as Singer. His father, Hillel Zeitlin, was a rabbi and a very important proponent of neo-Hasidism, and had his own literary salon in Warsaw at the time. And these two writers became very good friends, and they saw eye to eye in regard to Yiddish, the purpose and the vision of Yiddish literature in this period, which was like in opposition to this very ideological, politicized approach to Yiddish literature that was exemplified by many of the Soviet Yiddish writers. What's interesting is that they continued their very deep friendship also after the Holocaust. Aaron Zeitlin came to America and continued to write both in Yiddish and in Hebrew some of the most powerful Holocaust poetry. And Singer he was a very critical about everybody in the Yiddish and Hebrew world. But one of the writers that he always praised was Aaron Zeitlin. He thought of him as one of the great Jewish writers of the 20th century.
We'll take one more, well, we can take more, but one from Mr. Schaefer again, and then we'll come back to Yochanan and Shifra Lohan. Mr. Schaefer's question is Bashevis basically hopeful?
Well, that's a very, it's a very difficult question to answer. I would say that I wouldn't use the word hopeful, but I would say that there is a very fundamental shift from pre-Holocaust and the early writings that I have edited and which will hopefully be published next year. And then what we know about him, the American work after the Holocaust. The American work is there is a certain, I wouldn't call it a hopeful aspect to it, but there is a deeper insight into the human condition and some of the very dark visions of the pre-Holocaust work is kind of is absent from the American work, I would say, to a certain extent, but of course not completely, because some of the American works like Shadows on the Hudson and Enemy is a Love Story are also pretty dark. But there is a certain amount of, it's a different context, literary context for these works.
And now back to Yochanan and Schiffer for their second question. Please unmute yourself. Yochanan and Schiffer Lowen. They still have a raised hand, but I don't hear them making a response. In the meantime, let me ask a question. When Singer was writing for the Forwitz, he also used the name Yitskhok Warshawski. What was that about?
Yeah, so, and this is very important. Good question. So basically, from the beginning of his career, he was affiliated with the Yiddish press, both in Warsaw and later in New York. In New York, it became primarily the Vorwärts, that's where he worked as a staff writer, as a journalist. That's where he serialized his novels. That's where he published his short stories and his memoirs and so on and so forth. But he was a very prolific writer. And what he did was, which was a very common thing in the Yiddish world, was to use different pseudonyms. And the first pseudonym he used was Yitshok Warshawski, Isaac from Warsaw. He started to use that, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in 1939. And he wrote some very good journalistic pieces under that name, and later wrote some very good quality pieces of fiction under that name, Yitshok Warshawski. Then he also used another name, a pseudonym called Dalet Seagal, which was kind of for the lighter journalism. We have from his memoirs, he talked about that he came into the editorial office at the Vorwärts, and they said, the editor said, give us an article by D. Siegel, and he just wrote it on the spot, basically. So these were very light pieces. So we know at least of these two pseudonyms, Yitshok Warshawski and Dalet Seagal. In Warsaw, he probably had some similar pseudonyms, but we haven't been able to locate them. We know that he wrote some different Schund novels and various other things under pseudonym, but we haven't been able to locate them, and maybe someday we will.
Other questions, please, either by raising your hand or by writing them into the chat. Okay, I have one more. There is some controversy about the Nobel Prize, and some have said that one reason he got it was because he was translated, and argued that there are at least two other Yiddish writers who were better, Avrom Sutzkever and Chaim Grade, but because they were not translated, they were not in the competition. Who's means the wegen then?
I think there's a lot of truth to that, actually. I mean, he made very early on a concerted effort to transport his Yiddish work. He wrote always only in Yiddish. He didn't write original pieces until very late in life in English. It was all in Yiddish. But he made a concerted effort to work with many translators in making his work available in English. And there's no doubt that that kind of opened it up and really spread the work to a much, much larger readership and enable him to kind of become, to be on the map of the Nobel Committee. But what happened in the 70s in Stockholm is a very interesting story, because there was a window that opened up for a writer like Bashevis singer. That would not have been possible in the 80s or in the 90s. It was that little window that opened up in the late 70s. And that was that they were looking for some writers that were outside the mainstream. And there was particularly one person on in the committee of the Swedish Academy who really lobbied very hard for Isaac Bashevis singer, and his name was Knut Anlund. And I think it's primarily because of this person, Knut Anlund, that he got the Nobel Prize. Anlund was able to persuade and make a case for Singer. And I can also just anecdotal say that Singer became extremely popular in Swedish translation. And one of his publishers sold more than 1 million copies of more than 30 of Singer's works in Swedish translation in a country of 9 million people, which is remarkable. So there was something about Singer and Sweden that really kind of clicked at that time.
There being no more questions. Wait. Yes, there is. From Miriam Cohn. Responding to Mr. Schwartz's question, please put the recommended books in the chat. She says, yes, please. Can you allow Mr. Schwartz's idea? I too would like it. So so let me say, I too would like it. So if you can put that in the chat easily, please do. Do you have the list yet?
What?
Two requests.
Of the new books about Singer?
Yeah, can you put them?
Yeah.
Also, Jeffrey Zische has a hand up.
Yochanan and Clara have put in a documentary film, a family journey from occult imprisonment to freedom, the fight for basic education for Hasidic children. And it's a hashtag pioneers. And there are a number of other comments. One I'll read at the end. First time ever achievement to reform the education system for Hasidic boys in Quebec. And well, they're coming in like wildfire now.
Zische has his hand up, Jeffrey.
Oh, where? Two participants raised hands. Hold on.
I've asked Zische to
I
unmute.
see Zische. So he is muted. Zische, would you please unmute yourself?
Zische, you may unmute. He doesn't know how. You should be able to unmute.
No.
Oh, there you go,
Yeah,
Zische.
yes, okay, thanks. Very enlightening referat, Dank, Jen. I missed the very beginning of it, so I don't know if you addressed this, but I understand there's a newly published story by Singer in Yiddish called Der Charlatan.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you knew when it was written and if it was originally serialized in the forward. And because I understand this is the first time it's published in Yiddish, although I've seen translations of it. And how can I get a copy of that in the original Yiddish, if you know?
Yeah. Okay. I just want to finish this. Then I'll answer your question. So that it's very interesting. There are two new books of Singer's original Yiddish novels serialized in the forwards that have been published in the last 2 years. One is the one you mentioned, and the other one is Sonim, a Geschichte von Liebe, which came out a year ago in the original Yiddish. And it was published by
Enemies, a love story.
Enemies, a love story. And it was published by a small press in Lund, Sweden. And that is where I teach. That's where my Yiddish program is located. It's one of my former students, his name is Niklas Oliansky, who started a Yiddish publishing firm. And he has published this book in Sonim, a Geschichte von Liebe, Enemies, a love story in the original Yiddish. I think the charlatan, I don't,
Would whoever is speaking, please not do so, Professor.
I don't know if the charlatan was also published by this publisher or another publisher, but you can probably Google it and find out. Yeah.
Okay, I think we need to come to a close, but I want to leave this open because Professor Schwarz has listed the number of books, writings requested by by 2 people. So I don't want to knock it off. You should spend, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes having a look at that list.
Yes, it is in the chat portion.
Yeah, in the chat. And by others. So let's just take a couple of minutes here. Maybe while you're doing that, Jan, tell us about Sweden and Yiddish now.
Okay, I mean, what's happening in Sweden is really a nes min hashemayim, a miracle from heaven. So what happened here in Sweden is that Yiddish was declared a national minority language in year 2000. And the question is, of course, are there that many Yiddish speakers in Sweden? And the answer is no. There are probably less than, I don't know, 500 Yiddish speakers in the whole country. But it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the status of Yiddish in Sweden based on its continuous use in the country for 200 years, which has been documented. And it has to do also with contemporary politics, and particularly with a way for the Swedish government and Swedish society to come to terms with their collaboration with Nazi Germany during the beginning of the World War II. And this is a way, I mean, you can use the German term, it's a way of Wiedergutmachen. But to make a long story short, because of that, because Yiddish is an official national minority language, like 4 other minority languages in Sweden, there is plenty of funding for Yiddish culture in Sweden. And the university where I have taught for 12 years now, they are now hiring 3 new full-time faculty members in Yiddish. And it's thanks to the funding from the government. And there are a lot of other activities I don't have time to go into it, but Sweden has become the neue Center for Yiddish in Europa. There's no doubt about that. And there are seminars. There's a Yiddish language center in Stockholm now. They have an annual seminar and so on and so forth. You can go in and find out more about it by Google it, basically.
Well, I want to thank everybody for attending on the Verstehen Zugaben and their contributions. And of course, I want to thank Professor Schwarz. There are no thanks enough for your presentation for us today. And we will end now. We wish all of you well, and we wish you well too. And Lomer Zumeven, mehr wie einmal a Jahr. Okay, thank you very much.
Großen Dank. Großen Dank.